Hi, my name is Allison Carroll. ADR was my first career and is my only career. Of course, the traditional narrative is that you have to be a retired judge, most likely an older white male with decades of experience before you can be a successful mediator. And while that may be true for a lot of practicing mediators, there is an increasing number of us who have successfully carved out our own career path in dispute resolution. Earlier in our careers, many of us right after graduation. In 2014, I started the video blog ADRisaFirstCareer.com to capture these stories, to combat this narrative. I started by interviewing Donna Erez-Navot and Tracy Frisch. Donna and Tracy had put together a panel discussion on this topic during the 2014 annual conference for the ABA dispute resolution section. And it was at that conference that we started to realize that there were more and more of us who had chosen this career path, this unbeaten path, this unique path, and we're really happy that we had done so. Since starting the blog in 2014, we've captured over 50 stories of individuals who work as ADR practitioners, administrators, professionals in government, nonprofit, higher education, and some who've opened up their own practice. 7 years later, we wanted to revisit some of these stories to see where people have gone, what challenges and support they've had as they continue their careers in dispute resolution, as well as insights into opportunities they see that might be stemming from the society's experience over the past 19 months. Ashley Davis, Jason Harper, Gururaj Kumar, and Oladeji Tiamiyu each chose ADR as a first career and are all featured on the ADR's First Career video blog. Each of them have had a lot of career growth since they first did their blog. When I first met Ashley and interviewed her for the blog, she was a program manager at the Center for Conflict Resolution in Chicago. Jason was just launching his private mediation business and consulting with the Los Angeles Office of Education. I actually met Oladeji before doing our interview when he was an intern at Resolution Systems Institute, about to launch a career in big law before he pivoted and joined the Harvard Clinical Program on Negotiation and Mediation at Harvard Law School. And Guru Raj, I met decades ago when we both found ourselves in The Hague, Netherlands, attending a month-long program as college students with the International Institute for Mediation and Conflict Resolution. When we reconnected years later to do his first video for the ADR's First Career video blog, he was an independent consultant doing training and working with organizations to help with conflict resolution. Each of these individuals came to dispute resolution from slightly different paths. They work in different practice areas and types of organizations. I've asked them to share an update on their careers, talk a little more about how they continue to navigate this unique career path and what changes they're beginning to see take place in our profession. All right, y'all, so to get us started, do you mind sharing where you're at today, what you're doing, and maybe what your training degree or certification was that sort of supported or launched your ability to pursue this type of work?
So my name is Ashley Davis. So I'm currently at the University of Washington practicing as an ombud, or an ombudsman, is the original title. And then I'll say I have a degree from the University of Wisconsin, the other UW, their law school, so the University of Wisconsin in Madison. So I graduated in 2013.
Wow.
I'll pass the mic to Jason.
All right. Thank you very much, Ashley. Hello, everyone. I'm Jason Harper. I am a private mediator practicing in employment, workplace disputes, as well as special education. In addition to being a private mediator, I'm also an alternative dispute resolution consultant for about 70 districts and 110 charter schools throughout the country, in and outside of California, where I'm based. I'm based in Los Angeles. I also teach cross-cultural dispute resolution at the University of Southern California Gould School of Law. And I have a master's in negotiation, conflict resolution, and peace building from California State University in Dominguez Hills. And that is what really helped propel my career in ADR. So Guru Raj, I'm handing the mic to you.
Thanks, Jason. Well, welcome everybody. So my name is Guru Raj. That's my first name, and my last name is Kumar. And I'll start with my educational background. So my educational background is I have my master's in international peace and conflict resolution, and I also studied organizational change management at American University in Washington, D.C. And that is really what sparked my career for the past 20 years. My work has been primarily around conflict management, organizational effectiveness, and leadership development. And when I explain that to people, it's typically around adults behaving badly in organizations, helping organizations work better, and doing a lot of training work. So that's really what my background has been in the last 20 years. What I'm doing currently is I'm a consultant working with an organization, and I work primarily with the USAID, which is the United States Agency for International Development, providing organizational effectiveness, organizational resiliency, and conflict management to headquarters and missions around the world to support aid and aid workers in their mission. So with that, I'm going to pass it to our last panelist, Oladeji. You want to bring it to a close?
Yeah, thank you, Guraj, and thank you, Allison, for organizing this. It's actually really humbling to be on a panel with everyone. So I'm really excited to be learning and hearing from the rest of you. So for me, I'm a clinician at Harvard's Negotiation Mediation Clinical Program. And I got my law degree from there as well. And I'd actually say if it was possible, I would have gotten like a certificate, also a specialization in ADR if I had the opportunity as a law student, because so much of my law school experience really just focused on ADR. And so in my current capacity as a clinician, a lot of my research is focused on tech-based dispute system design work and also truth and reconciliation commissions. And the TRC, I would say, was working in that had a big impact in kind of going back to when I was a law student, I got to be in the Gambia working on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That really led me to want to get more immersed in this subject matter. So that was a big influence for me. And I'm actually just curious for others. I imagine that the motivations between us for pursuing ADR is quite different and has changed over the years since I'm the newest, I guess, into the field of ADR. So maybe to just ask you, Jason, what led you to pursue a career in ADR?
Oh, well, so it's kind of a winding road. So at first I was a 7th grade algebra teacher in a whole other life. And, but I wanted to be an attorney to your point a little bit. And so I became a paralegal and I got to see the day-to-day life of, civil litigation, dealing with, corporate stuff, living the downtown LA, the stereotypical downtown LA lifestyle, swimming with sharks every day. And honestly, the fight was not attractive to me. That everyday fight of litigation was just not appealing whatsoever. It didn't fit me from like in my spirit, in my heart. It just didn't fit. It wasn't me. But I saw that mediation fit so much more. I went to my very first day in mediation training. It hit me like a ton of bricks. Oh, this is what I'm supposed to be doing with my life. It was the fact that we were able to, sit down and be that neutral party, be that third person to help people talk things through and get to a better place. That was the antithesis of what I was living in the legal field, and that told me everything I needed to know right then and there, and that was my inspiration to really look at ADR as a career path. Ashley, was it the same for you, or what was your journey like?
Yeah, thanks for asking the question. For me, it was not as serendipitous, I guess, in the same way. So I was able to take a mediation clinic that was offered by my law school in the last year. So it was actually the last year the professor was there, and I was able to get in right before they left and take that in the very last semester of my time in law school. So it was a great experience. We were in the Dane County courthouses doing traditional mediations there, co-mediations there specifically. And so that was kind of the launch of my mediation experience. And from there, I, like all the folks who graduated at the time looking for a job, came back to Chicago. Really, the primary interest I had was public interest. So getting into something that was doing, because I wanted that loan forgiveness. So also just really was interested in helping people. So that was my primary goal. So I looked was looking around for different positions in government, federal, local, nonprofits, and there was an opportunity that opened up at CCR, which is the Center for Conflict Resolution in Chicago, in the fall. And so I interviewed and was able to get that position as a program manager of mediation services there. And so did that for 5 years, which kind of opened me up in all kinds of ways, because we did essentially everything, which is not, I think, how every other mediation center is structured, but serving the city of Chicago, providing free mediation services across the city. So doing that traditional thing that I was doing kind of in Dane County for a larger, much larger scale on a team of 4 people, but then also doing 40-hour mediation trainings, which a lot of folks do, and then also doing in-house training. So I was responsible for the law school's clinics there as well, training them and getting them ready to enter into our programs. We also were getting cases referred to us from juvenile justice system and from family law and divorce. So we kind of ran the gamut in terms of any kind of case that you might have thought might come through the door. So that was kind of how things got started for me, and did about 2,000 cases a year there on that team of 4. So we were really in the streets, beating the pavement, making it happen. But I'll ask and check in with Guru Raj, what was your motivations, or what were they?
Yeah, well, no, thank you, Ashley. I'm just taking a moment to hearing 2,000 cases a year with 4 people.
That's tough.
Yeah, I need a Gatorade just hearing that, because I'm exhausted just hearing the kind of work that you were doing. No, this is a great question, and I've been rattling it in the back of my head. And to be quite candid, what got me into this was the summer after my sophomore year in college. This is not ADR related, but I worked at a summer camp for people with mental and physical disabilities, and it was a real powerful experience for me. And when I finished that summer, I decided that every summer during my collegiate, while I was in college, that I wasn't going to go do something traditional. I wanted to do something really interesting and something different, and just really explore that. And during my junior year in college, I came across an ad in the school paper. Some of you may not know that there was a time that colleges actually had a physical paper at their colleges that you would get every day. And so in the paper, there was an ad for a program for it was the internet IIMCR, and there's another panelist that actually was at the same program that I was at, the International Institute for Mediation and Conflict Resolution, and it was a month-long symposium at The Hague in Holland. And threw my name in the hat, got lucky enough to get in, and it was an amazing experience. It was just really 30 days of intensive, just hearing different speakers around different aspects of conflict resolution, ADR work around the world, and how people are doing it from, Oladeji, what you've shared around some of your work that you were really inspired you to court reporting and mediation at the highest level. And it really sparked an interest in me. And then I happened to graduate from college and did not do well. And so I was fixing photocopiers at night and trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And I took the LSAT twice. The LSAT told me that law school did not want me, but I needed to make a decision in my life to say I need to do something other than fix photocopiers. And I thought back on that program and that summer at The Hague and how influential that was. And then I searched out grad programs around peace and conflict resolution, and that's really what jump-started it. And from there, it was the right decision. I think, Jason, the way you framed it is like when you went to that training and you were like, this is it. There's never been a question that is this it or not. There's been questions about how am I doing it and where I should be doing it. But the values and the impact that this type of work can make is what keeps me going and what's really sparked this. And so, Oladeji, this goes back to you, man. You asked this great question, so we're all waiting to hear what sparked you.
Yeah, thanks, Guru Raj. And I just, your trajectory in and of itself, I think, is really beautiful and speaks a bit to serendipity and just going with the flow and embracing what comes from it. So For me, thinking on what motivated me, actually, I would say a lot of it dealt with what I did before law school. And so before law school, I was a teacher at a secondary and primary school abroad.
All right.
And I'm in a primary school where there's just a lot of conflict between students, tons of it. And every day I had to figure out, was I going to send people to the principal's office? Are they going to be sent home after that? Or am I going to like just kind of roll up my sleeves and try to reach a informal resolution with these students before having to send them to an office? And so after a couple of months doing that, I was like, wow, I'm enjoying this. Of course, I don't like seeing conflict with my students, but I'm enjoying like trying to find a resolution between them, and in many ways non-obvious resolutions. So with time, I finished teaching there and I started law school. And frankly, I started law school very deeply skeptical, going back to what you shared, Jason, about traditional litigation and adversarial approaches to reaching resolutions.
Right.
And I just reflected on my students and I was like, if every time they got in a conflict, I had to send them back to the principal's office and there's like a 40% chance they're going home, they're not learning anything, am I doing them justice? And so because of this deep skepticism in law school with adversarial litigation, I devoted so much time to exploring paths that were outside of adversarial litigation. And I would say that's kind of non-traditional for many law students in their first year to be like exploring non-court-based systems.
For sure.
And so I fell upon this field called alternative dispute resolution. And that was exactly what I was looking for. And I didn't really know all about it before I started law school, but it really spoke to a lot of my interests in engaging with the world and with dispute systems. So after that, it was just kind of like exploring, experimenting, and kind of being open to different approaches. Even outside of mediation, I mentioned the truth and reconciliation piece, and that one caught me off guard, the amount of value that can be brought to on a system-wide basis outside of courts, just through, in many ways, dialogue. So that really piqued my interest, and my interest is still being piqued, frankly, like every week. And I'm really fortunate to be in this path with ADR.
Oladeji, I just got to jump in because I am just hearing from all of y'all is just, it just warms me so much because I didn't realize I had so much in common with y'all from actually doing that community work. That was kind of how I kind of cut my teeth in the mediation space, doing community mediations. Guru Raj and LSAT told me the exact same thing, so I feel it. And Oladeji, look, when I first started interning, after my very first mediation training, I was interning at the LA County, Los Angeles County Bar Association, and they didn't have much for me, but they did tell me that, you know, one opening that we have is this middle school all the way out in the valley, where they're doing peer mediation. And I thought, initially I felt legit like it was a step backwards for me because I told you before, I was a 7th grade algebra teacher. I'm not trying to go back to the classroom. I'm trying to be an adult mediator doing adult stuff. But I ended up taking it for a number of reasons. But when I got there, it really like made me love mediation that much more. And it made me get it that much more than I ever could doing the training sessions, because I learned so much by teaching. And so by teaching these students how to mediate their own disputes and then supervising them, mediating the disputes within their own student body, as opposed to the punitive nature of sending them to the office, like that really opened it up even further for me. So I just realized that I have so much in common with all of y'all. This is really, really cool. So I'm very, very appreciative. I'm even more appreciative of being here now. Yeah, we're gonna have a good time. We're gonna have a really good time.
And you know, Jason, I want to thank you for sharing that, because one thing that struck me across these 4 stories is like, I don't think any of us would draw a straight line from like when maybe this idea populated in our head to like what we're doing now. You know, in my head, I'm like, there's a lot of curves and ins and outs on this. And I'm really wondering amongst all of us, honestly, like what's kept you in this game? Like, was it a piece of advice early on, or is it something now? Because I think that's one of the biggest challenges is that there's not a playbook to follow or a real career path to continue this. So I'm wondering what keeps everybody in this and motivated.
Yeah, I'll say that just generally, I think that's a great question. I'll say generally, you know, the scope of what kind of keeps me in it is that there's always something new, I think, to explore. So I'm somebody who likes to have just different ideas and ways of doing practice. So new tools that come up, I'm excited about learning about them and adding them to my practice, or just different ways of engaging the work is, I think, one of the things that keeps it interesting. But I'll say that it hasn't been a straight path, I think, partially because there isn't a lot of guidance along the way. So a lot of this is very much troubleshooting, you know, and applying for a bunch of stuff, getting it, not getting it, and attempting, you know, and putting your name, you know, in the ring, so to speak, for different kinds of opportunities, and just kind of being curious, you know, which is one of the things that they tell you is really important. But I think I wish there were more resources for people, because I do think there'd be more folks interested in pathways if there was a clearer or more helpful guidance or resources that folks could tap into without so much so having to do that on their own. And because you do have to stay motivated, I think, internally as a self-starter, to continue to pursue something that's not like very clear. It's very opaque. And I think for some people, if you want like a very easy answer, like get this job, get 6 figures, you know, that's not necessarily how it works. And especially if you're a younger practitioner and not someone who came out of the gate as a judge that is trying to go into a second career at a certain point. So I don't know if that resonates for anybody else in terms of kind of how you've thought about your practice, or what's motivating you to stay in, either Oladeji or Jason. I don't know if you had any thoughts there.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. Well, I will say the first thing that keeps me motivated, the primary thing, is I guess the nature of my area of practice, particularly special education, right? And so what I do as a mediator is, or what I think I do, I'd like to think I do, is I help mend the relationship between families and schools, right? Because the school is like the foundation of a kid's socialization, their education, all of those things, right? And so when there's a rift between a family and a school, or a school district, or a local education agency, however folks tend to call them, I mean, it's huge. And in special education in and of itself, just as a concept, in the United States, it starts from age 3, and they age out of special education services at 22. So that's a 19-year-long relationship. That's longer than a lot of marriages nowadays. And so in those situations, you have to kind of be the one to build that team back up. You have to be the one to try to mend that relationship, because, and you have to be the one to teach them how to communicate with each other, because the conflict is going to come up again eventually. You're not with somebody for 19 years and, you know, only one time is there ever an issue. It's going to come back up. So I get motivated by helping guide and helping rebuild that team. I mean, they're doing most of the work, but that's what keeps me motivated. But, you know, as far as advice goes, oh man, I mean, as a solo practitioner, and in an industry and in an area where a lot of the attorney mediators that also have a JD, we're getting a lot or, you know, 80 to 90% of the paid mediations. You know, from my standpoint, it was looking kind of bleak. And, you know, when you're looking for advice as a solo practitioner, you're looking at, how do you promote yourself? How do you, you know, how much are you charging people? I mean, what are you, you know, how are you getting your name out there? How are you letting people know that you exist, that this is what you do, and that you're pretty good at it? And so the first bit of advice that I got was from my very first mentor, who said, obviously the litigated case is, playing the odds, it's not going to work out for you. That was what I was told. And then she told me, what you're going to want to do, what you're going to want to lean on is something that cold, right? Everybody's going after landlord-tenant disputes. Everybody's going after divorce. Everybody's going after commercial mediation. That's not you. That's not what you're going to get if you try to go after. You're going to run your head up against a brick wall every day. So what is it that cold? And she asked me that, and I said, well, I mean, I used to teach algebra, so education, I know that pretty well. And she said, well, that's going to be your niche, straight up. And I did what I was told. And I said, all right, well, education it is. And special education, I had a background in that. And so I decided to make that my niche. And what you told me was true at the time, but that, in my own experience, that has evolved over the years. Now I don't necessarily think that it's about, if you don't have a JD, you shouldn't go after the litigated case. I mean, most of the cases that I handle now are litigated cases, but so that I would amend. But that was the initial advice that I got, and for the most part, she was right, and I'm thankful. Oladeji, what about you, man?
Yeah, it's so interesting what motivates me in this industry. And I would actually say a lot of it is both from a theoretical and a experiential perspective. The theoretical is, for me, ADR has consequences. Dispute systems overall have consequences. And like, if we really are engaged with advancing justice, promoting greater equity, how we resolve disputes, how those disputes are managed, that is at the essence of a just society, right? So for me, a lot of what I care about in ADR is really revolving around the ethics and the norms that we adopt. Those have the consequences, and in many ways they are implicit, but bringing those to the surface on a daily or weekly basis, I think that keeps me really motivated. And also I get to be involved in that conversation, and I try to be involved in that conversation, whether it's with students, whether it's with other faculty, whether it's with practitioners, being involved in that and shifting the norms so that there's more representation and understanding for those who have historically been excluded from those conversations. I think that's what keeps me excited and motivated. And many of these norms are up for grabs. They aren't set in stone. And I get excited being able to have dialogues about those norms. And so the thing is, and I'm actually curious for everyone else on the panel, and I'm looking at you, Guru Raj, especially, because being motivated, to a certain extent, it comes in ebbs and flows. And I would say sometimes it is most closely connected to when we experience the challenges in our profession. And so I'm just quite curious, like, what those challenges are for each of you and how you use these motivations that we've already described to manage those challenges.
Yeah, I'm saddened that you wanted to hear from me first around this, because I know there's going to be better stuff. But that question about challenges, actually, the way you framed it, just hearing everyone's story about what motivates them, honestly, the motivation that I'm hearing is about the challenge, right? Ashley was just straight hustle, being on the street, hustling. Jason, it was straight, like, how you framed how you have those conversations with families and families in educational systems to be able to create that. It's the challenge. Oladeji, what you were talking about, it's the challenge around this work, which is, I think, makes this work so unique compared to everybody else, because some might say it's all love but no joy, right? You have nothing but love for this work, but you're dealing with challenges all the time. Challenges from perception of what is this work. Like, Jason, I'm still going to go back to you about how you framed what you do. Is like, other industries have an elevator pitch that you learn, and that you walk into a room and you say, You know, I do this and everybody's clear around it. When you work in ADR, conflict management, you've got to figure out a way to explain it to others to help get that buy-in from society, from industry, whatever that is, and to also sell yourself, you know. And so, you know, I went off on a pivot about the challenge piece, but I think, Oladeji, what you're asking me is like, not only the challenge about doing the work, but the challenge that we're seeing in the work. I think that's what your question is. Am I hearing that correctly? Yeah, so I'm just tap dancing my way through this question. I would say there's a lot of pieces around it. I mean, I think the first one is just how we're having this conversation right now. Like Jason, the way you framed it, I want to be with all of you in this moment in a room having this conversation. Yet we're on 5 screens doing this. And I would say probably across the board, what's cutting across the planet is we're doing this work like this. That would be my first. I mean, I can name 1,000 things I can say that are challenges, but I'll say this is the first one because I can tell you the way I was trained, it was, how do you seat people in a room? You know, where do you sit in a room? You know, what's the table look like? I mean, that was like mediation 101.
Yep, sure was.
And nobody taught me how to do a breakout room in a Zoom in graduate school. So I don't know about Ashley. I'll pivot to you. Like, what do you think?
I know we did not learn about how to do breakouts in our original 40-hour mediation trainings or anything like that. So I definitely would echo those things. I'll say in terms of overall challenges, a few things. So I'll say the storytelling element that you described, absolutely. Like, what story is the industry telling? And that's kind of something that I'm exploring a bit in my fellowship of like, the industry has been around for a long time. So it's been around since the 70s, right? But there isn't a clear story or narrative that's being put across as we're navigating spaces, hence why we have to keep explaining ourselves, right? So it's not clear and consistent across, which I think can then make it harder for people to get in the door. So then, because you're essentially selling preventative work, which doesn't necessarily for businesses isn't top of mind, right? Their first top of mind is usually making the money or doing the thing, whatever it is that they do, or organizations, not the conflict that might occur during that process. So in selling preventative work, most folks are more reactive than preventative. So then they're calling you in kind of on the aftermath to kind of resolve the thing. Or you're trying to show up in court to resolve something after it's atrophied so poorly that folks have shown up in court. So it's harder to kind of get over a little of those humps, I think, and then also just practitioner support along that journey. So what does that look like strategically as you're supporting folks to have a better, I think, life's journey and career as they're navigating through? I think those would be challenges. I'll say for me personally, I got the same kind of conversation while I was at CCR. I was thinking about pivoting. And then Jason, I spoke with someone who was in the federal government doing, I think it was community mediation service there. And they, at the federal level, they were just sharing, yeah, there's a hiring freeze right now. So you'd only get in if you had these certain exceptions. You really need to niche down essentially and figure out, because you can do all the things, but you need to find a niche. So then I pivoted to higher education because I saw that there were at least some jobs trickling out there consistently that I could apply to, and whether it was teaching, whether it was clinicians, whether it was conduct or investigator type positions for employees or for students. And so I kind of leaned into that space. So first, prior to getting this ombuds job, worked at Arizona State University doing conduct investigations, Title IX work, and some restorative justice there. Because I had to get, if I'm trying to pivot into the space, a lot of the questions were like, why do you really want to be here? How can we, know that you're really interested in this space? So that was the pivot for me that I had to do. So I did that work first, got a lay of the land. They were doing, as a university, because they had 5 campuses and an online apparatus, 5,000 cases a year in their office. And so I got a lay of the land there, great experience, top down, the full gamut of what investigations look like. which allowed me to then pivot into this position in higher education because I had that background. But if I had not had that, which one of the reasons my director told me he hired me was because I had that experience in higher education. So I would not have gotten the job that I have today without that background. And so then it's like, how are you expressing that or sharing that with folks to know, what do they need to do to enter into the field and have a career with longevity, especially if you're starting off earlier on. And so that was something that I had to do, but also I'll say I had my eye on ombuds work, and I knew that there were ombuds who did investigations. So I knew that that skill set would be useful regardless of if I did a classical ombuds position, which does investigations, or if I did a more organizational ombuds role, which is what I'm in now. So with just a higher ed background. So I'm curious if resonated for other folks, Oladeji or Jason, if you'd like to talk about challenges or additional motivations there.
Yeah, well, I mean, when you talk about challenges for me personally, I mean, two things that you mentioned really resonated. One was, the idea of niche down, right? Get a little bit more specific, because in my area, my geographic area, that is, the generalist gets little to nothing. People aren't looking for somebody that's a Jack or a Jill of all trades. They want a specialist. And so, that was one of the first things that I was told. You're going to need to, create that niche and roll with it. But the challenge, one of the biggest challenges that I got then, and to some extent today, less so, but it still appears, is a challenge of credibility. When I was first starting in, I told my mom that I wanted to be a mediator, and what she did was amazing. Looking back on it, she went on the JAMS website and she showed the panel and what they all looked like and what they all did, and she said, "Okay, well, let's take a look at this person. This person was practicing law for 30 years, is now a retired judge, and is on this neutral panel. This person was practicing for 25 years and is now doing, X, Y, and Z, and charges this amount. Where do you fit into all of these?" And most of these were older white faces. And I had just turned, I was 29 at the time. And so so she told me, "This is not going to go as easy as you think it will. I know that you feel like this is it, but I don't think it's going to be as easy as you think it will." And that right there turned out to be, true to a certain extent. I think every day was a fight for credibility, based on my age, based on, what I looked like. And I had to combat that with my knowledge base. So I had to really dig and dig and dig and dig and prove to people every day that I was, not just knowledgeable, but accessible. People could relate to me. And for some groups, it was easier than others, for sure. But that challenge was there all the time. And so that's something that was a challenge for sure that I've encountered and still encountered to this day, really. Oladeji, what about you, man?
Yeah, that's so gosh, it's funny because I asked this question and now I'm like trying to reframe the question. So I'd say challenges maybe for the field that I see and that I deal with on a weekly, daily basis is just complacency. And maybe I'll reframe that and say opportunities for growth and embracing change. So to me, an opportunity that our field has and that I individually have is to be open to more change in this field. And at the start, I mentioned, how I care a lot about the ethics and norms, and having those norms shift in a way that really can advance justice in really noteworthy ways. So what I see is that there's a certain level of comfort with the status quo, and it can allow individuals, including myself, to be really complacent. And if we're to ask ourselves and be sincere about this question, I'm just curious, like over the past 20 years, how ADR has changed pre-pandemic. And then when we zoom in on the past 19-ish months and see the noteworthy, significant changes that have come, and I would say the growth that has come for our field, for us individually due to the pandemic. And for me, I try to think about ways that we can kind of like work with that change instead of being comfortable with complacency. And so when we think broadly about what the pandemic has brought, ODR was a thing. It was a thing, and now it's essential.
Right, now it's the thing.
Yeah. And so I think of this opportunity, and it could even, I'm happy to even talk about broadly the pandemic and how it's impacted our work. But a opportunity that I see for me in an individual growth area is just working with the change that is inevitable within our field, helping more and more people have access to resolving disputes electronically and remotely, you know. And Ashley, since you're an ombuds, I would love to pivot to you and kind of just explore how the pandemic has introduced an opportunity for remote engagement with different stakeholders that are accessing your field.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'll say first, to your original point, and this could be the mediator in me, you were asking about, is justice at the center of the work? And I'm not sure that for all practitioners it is, to your original question. But to, follow up from there in terms of the conversation about complacency, I think one of the things working at a nonprofit you don't really have the room to do is be complacent, because you're always applying for new grants and opportunities. So we were always doing something new. There was always a new grant, a new something that we were doing, which is why we ended up at how many cases we were doing, was because we kept expanding our service to more and more spaces, to more and more people doing, so one of the things right before I left was like a expansion into potentially thinking about online dispute resolution, like literally right before I transitioned into a follow-up position. So I'll say in my current space, definitely there have been practitioners who are always online, who are always doing their work virtually. They always had kind of their own little separate section, but I think as you were referencing, this has become an essential element to everyone's work now. So for ourselves, I'll speak for my university, I'll say that we're planning to continue to offer virtual sessions, not planning any major moves to in-person work at this point. And it's partially just because, so for confidentiality purposes, which obviously would make sense, we don't have windows in our office. So we don't have any windows. There's no room for the air to escape. So we are just in there, hot boxing with possible COVID air. And that is not at all what we would like to be doing. And that would require a hefty investment, probably $4,000 to $5,000 for a really solid ventilator for air circulation and all of that. So for those reasons, we are going ahead and I believe just continuing our online practice. And I've heard from more ombuds than not that they are planning to continue to incorporate online services into their work, just because if you have multiple campuses, if you have, which some ombuds serve more than one, which we do as well. Some folks are just saying for disabled folks or for other people who are differently abled, or people are scared to show up physically to the office, because there are some places where physically walking into an ombuds office, that's kind of broadcasting to some folks that there's something going on. And so for more intimate spaces, it's like, you don't want anybody to see you going into the ombuds office, almost like going to HR in some ways. So I think continuing to offer that service so that it can allow for the whistleblower, the differently abled, the persons who are just uncomfortable walking physically to the space, that'll continue to be an offering. Now, how much depends on the workspace. I think But for us, I think it'll be continue to be an essential element. And I think for the field, I believe it will continue to be, because I also don't know when the pandemic is going to end. I don't have a crystal ball. So I think as it continues, if you're concerned about safety, you're concerned about air quality, et cetera, that'll be something that folks continue to engage with. I don't know if folks have other kind of thoughts on changes in the field in regards to kind of the technology aspect.
Sounds like that crystal ball is next to the window in your office. So
Yes.
I hear that. I hear that. Well, as far as the the challenges and the pivoting that's happened in the last 20 months, I think obviously ODR is it, right, at this point. I look at the benefits of it more so than anything else. And yeah, there are some that want to go back to that status quo of being in person and meeting and all of that. But the challenges are such that it's less and less feasible for a number of reasons. The folks that I mediate with, sometimes there are health concerns. Sometimes there are folks that are living with elderly folks, and so that consideration has to be at the forefront as well. But one of the other benefits is that traditionally, and this speaks to a lot of things. It speaks to the patriarchy, a number of other issues. Typically, it's the mothers that are the only ones coming to these mediations for education issues, I'll say. But with the shift to online, both parents are now able to come in, and that adds a new element to the discussion itself. And it allows space for the bond to get, repaired between the family and the district or the LEA in those particular moments. So I think from that standpoint, it's great to have ODR as a field, and as a person who is now privileged to be mentoring other mediators. One of the things that I tell new mediators is, geography means nothing anymore. I mean, there's really no more borders. I mean, that's how we're all meeting. I hadn't met any of you before this morning, and if I had just stayed in California, it's highly unlikely that it would have ever happened. And so I'm thankful for Zoom and WebEx and insert other video teleconference platform here, because it allows us to be able to get together and to exchange ideas and really talk things through and talk about challenges and talk about possibilities. I mean, speaking of what's going on 20 years ago to compared to now, I think the big thing that's changed is people are starting to see that there are way more areas where mediators can be in, way more spaces. Initially it was just the commercial litigation. Initially, it was just community mediation. I was meeting with a mentee of mine last week, and he's looking to get into blockchain mediation. And that is a space that is fascinating to me. And I know nothing about it. He's really all over the moon about it. And so we were just talking about that and what that's going to look like, not just today, but in the future. So, the level of the amount of spaces that we can go, now compared to 20 years ago, infinite. And I tell people, don't limit yourself just because, this was the standard area of mediation, in 95. I guess 2021, let's get to it. And it's out there. Oladeji, I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
So, I mean, you just said something that really piqued my interest, because I've been doing a lot of research into blockchain ODR and AI integrated ODR systems. And so it's serendipitous, but also timely that you even mentioned that. And I think, once with something like blockchain ODR, it really requires a shift in norms, because a lot of these platforms do crowdsourced decision making that allows more voices to provide input. And the historical norms have really limited the number of people who can be involved in a mediation as a neutral or an arbitration as an arbitrator. So there is a empowering movement, I would say, that's going on right now, where people who don't necessarily have experience or expertise in the ADR work, but have subject matter expertise. They don't have a law degree, but they have that subject matter expertise.
Right.
And they can now weigh in through crowdsourced decision making. And so that is a really exciting opportunity. And it's something that the field, the ADR field, needs to increasingly pay attention to. It doesn't need to be necessarily the blockchain. I think it's an important part of it, but blockchains just illustrate that certain norms that have been fundamental are not set in stone, that they can be context specific for different tools, whether tech or not, and context specific based on the type of dispute that's involved. Whereas I think a shift that I'm seeing over the past even past couple of years has been that a greater recognition of that a lot of these disputes are operating in a context, and what applies for in a pre-pandemic environment, for example, with ombuds, is totally different in a post-pandemic or in a pandemic world. And then once you introduce things like AI and blockchains into the conversation, then you can really expand what we like to call the multi-door courthouse, and you can allow more and more people to be involved in decision making rather than just one or two. So that's something that I think is really powerful. And geography means nothing. I love, that's a quote that I want to hold on to and latch onto, because it's the reality we're seeing now. And as something like ODR becomes, we've seen it essential for the short term, but as it transitions to becoming a norm, as Ashley mentioned in her work, when she recognizes the value of the confidentiality piece with her work, that is now expanded and even more sacrosanct during the pandemic, and the ease in promoting confidentiality with something like Zoom is much greater. So when we see this recognition that is becoming a default, a point of departure, I think it's going to introduce a lot more exciting changes into the field. I have this podcast, it's called Convergence, and I just kind of explore dispute systems and technology, the interconnection between those two. And I had someone on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, Joshua Crabtree from Bluegrass, and he's a legal aid director from Appalachia, and he's just talking about, in his jurisdictions, in the areas that he serves, there is an access to internet issue. And what the pandemic has required from all of us is to introduce creative solutions into the system. And what he's done is what he calls justice buses, where he has a bus with access to internet and he brings the courts to the people, right? And so what I'm seeing that has been accelerated over the past 19 months is the requirement to think creatively, right? It's not just like someone out there that's saying blockchain. It's like, now we have to think creatively about these things. And I'll pass it to Guru Raj, because I'm rambling here about these things.
Yeah, no, this has been a wild ride, just listening into everybody, and it's just like my mind goes one place and it goes someplace else. Like the last thing that you brought up, Oladeji, is one of my concerns about what the pandemic has brought, is that, well, it provides unbelievable access around where geography does not matter, and it provides the confidentiality and the safety for some of the work that we're doing where people should not be in the room together, and it provides that kind of not only safety, but pacing, right? We don't have to do this in 2 hours anymore when we book a conference room. We can do this when it works for people around scheduling, so on and so forth. But there's a big divide that's happening, and that's getting even wider from an access standpoint. Not only like from Appalachia, like what you're sharing, but from around the world. And so I love the way that you framed it, Oladeji, that there's an opportunity for creativity, but my concern is that are people thinking in that lens about that need to be able to support everybody to take advantage of this. And along those lines too, like Ashley, you used a word that really struck me, and you took it somewhere else, but you used the word storytelling, and you were talking about how do we sell our careers. But I think the work that we do, and we've been focusing a lot on mediation, but you brought up like truth and justice reconciliation processes, dialogue processes, all these other processes that fit within the world of dispute resolution, conflict resolution. There's an element that I wonder, that I struggle with by doing this over, looking at people on a screen. Are we fully hearing people's stories when we're only seeing them through the screen? And I know for myself, like I struggle with this. When I'm working with people, there's a tactile feel that comes with being with people that I don't get being on a Zoom call. And it might just be my own style that I overly rely on, that I'm learning to kind of navigate through. But that is one of my concerns. And that, Jason, for me, what you brought up around cross-cultural dynamics, right? Are we over relying on a particular style that is more celebrated, that works well in this environment? And part of this is others are getting excluded by, like Oladeji, what you've been talking about are the systems and the processes that we use to resolve disputes. I went off on a strange tangent, but I think this is, while it's working, we also need to, I am not an ethics guy, and Oladeji, I'm going to ask you or anybody else from a process ethics standpoint, we need to start thinking about the processes and the tools that we use in order to help support people through a conflict situation. And is that creating fairness and equity and transparency? I can share, I've done a lot of work around, and one thing I wanted to share, we've been talking about a lot of mediation through this lens of mediation, but I think the skill sets that you learn through ADR are transferable to other places, right? One thing I've been doing is work around DEI, after the murder of George Floyd, doing dialogue work around that experience and healing and trauma. I'm not a trauma therapist, but some people frame it that way, right? How do we bring these expertise into those spaces? And so thinking from a broader standpoint, how do we bring these tools with the access that we get via Zoom, via WebEx, via whatever you want to use, and expand our own toolkit and our own perceptions of what we bring to the spaces that need it? I don't know. I just brought up 500 things that that were not knitted together. So I need an ADR professional to kind of bring this together to what I just said, because I didn't really coherently think about it.
Yeah, I think based on what I was hearing is just that there's a lot of change coming. I mean, you're trying to think critically about how do you integrate the new access points to kind of apply that fairness and equity lens to kind of shore up our work for today's challenges, it sounds like. Because the need today is more expansive. It might be blockchain, it might be special education, it might be, the juvenile justice system, it might be truth and reconciliation commissions. And so how are we shoring up our work to have the tools and the skill set to show up well in those spaces with an appropriate lens, I think. And so I would say, I think that's probably why there's a bit of a demographic shift in terms of seeing just different people come into the field, but they're coming through different doors. They're not necessarily coming through the traditional law school route. They're coming through restorative justice is really popular, honestly, in higher education. Now people are starting centers and spaces all over in a way where kind of mediation clinics are pretty kind of even keeled. There hasn't been many additions, and there may have been some subtractions. To my understanding, in terms of how that space is being supported in the legal space, or people just go take a 40-hour training or get a certificate in something and then show up in the space and then start doing the work. So then it's how are folks accessing ADR? They're accessing it from differently than just the traditional, I think, ABA kind of framework, which then begs the question, are we actually telling the story, or are we actually containing or moving the field in any kind of particular direction? Because it's spreading out in all these spaces, which is great. And I think it's excellent, but it also means that people don't necessarily always have an intellectual grounding or home somewhere, right? So if you're just grounded in kind of one very niche, a niche of a niche of a niche space, right? Then how do you kind of connect back to those other lenses, to those other kind of critiques or concerns or questions that maybe folks have had years ago, like about confidentiality and what does that really mean? Or about neutrality and what does that really mean? You know, all of the central elements, you know, sacred cows of our work have been critiqued and, you know, explored ad nauseum. But if you're not you don't know anything about that because you got a certificate somewhere that's not attached to any of that work. So how do you continue to practice those ethics? Think about your work, add to your toolkit to continue to kind of show up in a way where that's well informed. And so I think that's a space that I'm interested in exploring, but just in general, I think that could be a great access point for the field to make sure that the demographic changes are supported so that there are younger people there. There are people who have different backgrounds, different degrees, different lenses of understanding in the space, but you also want them to have a certain skill level to be able to do right by that conversation or do right by that dialogue in a way where both parties feel served by the person who was there. And so I think that's important, is figuring out how do we support that structure, how do we support that process and resource for practitioners, I think.
I'm going to step in there and say I think you all have inspired folks who might be watching to realize that there's not only many paths to this work, this work comes from many different places, and that it can go in so many different directions. But how do we connect with each other, and how do we support each other through some of that change and growth? And so I hope people are hearing those, to use Oladeji's word, that opportunity that's coming from those changes, but watching out for some of those inequities that Guru Raj was mentioning. And so how can we as a field tend to that, both by broadening and supporting folks who might be joining us or might be coming into the career as a first career. Ashley, Jason, Guru Raj, and Oladeji, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to share your stories and insights with us.
Thank you.
Thanks.